Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Maine Take. My name is Dana Connors. I'm pleased to be the host of this program brought to you by the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. By now, you know our format. Our plan is to talk about some of the issues, ideas, and initiatives that work in our state, and do that through a guest who is involved in one of those issues or ideas. And today we have a very special guest, very timely guest in terms of what is going on in our economy, the issues we face, what's next for us. And that person is our state economist, Amanda Rector. Amanda has been with the state actually since 2004. Initially, she was a research assistant for economic issues at the Department of Labor, as I recall. Then she moved to the planning office, where she also was an economist, and now, and has been since 2011, the state economist. And we are very grateful that she is on our show today. And as you can imagine, her time is precious. She is sought after to help us better understand what has gone on, where we are today, and what do we see for the future. And Amanda, we're so privileged that you have taken the time to be with us today and to help us better understand. We know what's brought us to this point. In March of 2020, it was an eye-opener for us that we thought probably was a few months and that would go away. Well, here we are 2.5 years later. Not only has the pandemic been with us and still kind of lingers on, not the degree perhaps that initially was, for sure, but many of the issues that followed, whether it was the war that affected energy, food, fuel, inflation, and the costs that went with it. But in that first few years of bringing us up today, and that's where I begin, we were the recipient of a lot of federal money, and it was well used. Can you share with us your perspective on that and how that helped us dealing with the many issues that was confronting us during this very challenging time?
Absolutely. I'm very happy to be here with you today. I appreciate the invitation. I want to actually start back just before the pandemic hit, when the state released the 10-year economic development strategy, because that was really laying out, okay, long term, where do we want to be? What investments do we need to make to really put Maine off in a good direction for future economic growth? And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and we thought everything was totally derailed and we would have to rethink all of our plans. But actually, the pandemic highlighted the fact that a lot of those investments that we were thinking about needing were actually even more important than we thought. Things like workforce development, broadband, housing, childcare. All of those, the list goes on and on, but those things that we were really prioritizing in that development strategy. And so when federal funds came in, Maine was able to pivot really fast and identify those places, both from the economic development strategy and the work of the Economic Recovery Committee, where we could make investments with those funds to help different industries, different sectors, people recover and set us up for growth in the long run. So if you look at where that federal funding has come in and where it has been deployed, a lot of those areas, things like, certainly a lot of it is direct business support, both for businesses and nonprofits around the state. But a lot of it is going into things like childcare. It's going into housing. It's going into things around energy and trying to diversify our energy sources towards more sustainable sources. And I think also things like federal funds that were transferred into the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. I think there was an announcement, I forget if it was last week or the week before, but essentially next year, employers are going to have lower unemployment insurance taxes because of those transfers that were put in to help bolster that system. So I think in a lot of different cases, the funds that are being deployed from the federal government are being deployed in such a manner that not only is it helping now in terms of recovering from the pandemic, but it's setting us up for success in the long run. And I think that's a reason for a lot of optimism.
Yeah. And I don't from my point of view, I want to dwell on that point, but boy, what you said is so accurate. I mean, when you think about, it was 2019, like you said, 1,300 people throughout the state came together. And I don't know whether it was just great intuitive thinking or whether it was divine guidance, but whatever was in that plan set us up in the best way possible for not only the future, but for what we didn't expect to come our way, the pandemic. Yeah, it proved, as you mentioned, it proved to be such a worthy document then, but also now and in the future. So hats off to everybody that ever participated in that, because it was spot on. Absolutely. We're seeing it every day. So give us a sense of, we've been through the pandemic. In its wake, we've had the war. We've seen the worker shortage, we've seen supply chain issues, inflation is catching us all. There's very few things that aren't affected by inflation. We speak a lot of groceries, motor fuel, house fuel, energy costs, electricity costs, but it touches just about all of our issues, and a great deal of anxiety today exists because of inflation. And when will it end, and will it be a recession or not? Give us a sense from your perspective, where are we today?
Yeah, so let's talk about inflation first, because I think that's one of the things that everybody wants to know right now,
Yeah,
because it's so visible in so much that we do. It's hard to forget about it at this
yes,
point in time. So, early on, when inflation first started ramping up, a lot of what was happening really was driven by supply chain issues. And there was a lot of demand out there from people who had been, stuck at home, wanting to make more purchases of goods. There was adequate funds for them to be able to do that, because there were a lot of supports that were put in place so that people were able to continue to make purchases, but also particularly for higher end folks who normally spend more on services, they weren't able to do that. They couldn't go anywhere. So they were able to spend more on goods. And then in addition to that sort of that higher level of demand, we had problems with places being shut down because of COVID, transportation issues, backlogs at ports. There were weather related issues. So some things that were completely unrelated to COVID, but happening at the same time. And so prices started to increase initially, largely because of these supply side challenges. Now, at this stage of the game, most of those have worked their way out. There's no backlog at ports anymore. Retailers have plenty of stock on hand of most things. Where we're seeing inflation now, and it has broadened. So it is across more service sectors. We saw that base of where we were seeing price inflation happen broaden. We are seeing a lot of it coming from shelter most recently. So housing prices, of course, have gone up, and not just home ownership, but rental costs have gone up dramatically. And that gets reflected in the shelter line of inflation. But then certainly also energy and food prices were a big contributor. And a lot of that spiked around the time that Russia invaded Ukraine. We saw energy prices spike, and then food prices increased as well. The energy price piece of it, let me delve down a little bit more on that, because I think that's a piece that people are particularly concerned about. If you look at consumer sentiment has been weighed down recently, in large part because of inflation being so high. And a lot of that, particularly in Maine, is troubling when it's coming from higher energy prices. We're so reliant on heating oil to heat our homes and businesses. And gasoline, because we're a big rural state and everybody has to drive all over the place. So when we see those prices as high as they are, it's really concerning for sort of future economic growth, because if you're spending that much money on heating your home, heating your business, filling your gas tank, that's a lot of money you're not spending in other parts of the economy. And so that's always a factor that we look at when we're thinking about the economic forecast, is what are those energy prices doing? Now, the Federal Reserve Bank has been increasing interest rates fast and furious to try to bring down inflation. It does seem like inflation is starting to ease, but we're still seeing some of the core inflation prices, and some of that really, the shelter piece is a big chunk of that. We haven't really seen those start to turn a corner too much yet. Hopefully we will. Hopefully we will continue to see prices and inflation come down, and hopefully quickly enough that the Federal Reserve Bank, while they're continuing to increase interest rates, maybe doesn't have to do quite the dramatic interest rate rises that they have been, because of course that has an effect on the affordability of housing as well, because mortgage rates have increased so much in response.
I think it was one of the presentations that you had made to an organization or a club, whatever, and in which it was reported that you said this inflation could be with us until 2027 and various levels of it. And yet I'm going to terribly oversimplify it. And you know as well as I'm not an economist, but it sounds like we're getting terribly close to a possible recession if it continues to extend to a broader impact in our economy, but also to be lingering for a period of time. Do you worry about that? I mean, is that in the back of your mind as to whether we are getting close to that or not?
Yeah, so the forecast, and I know exactly where that's coming from. So that's coming from the state's Consensus Economic Forecasting Commission, and they met at the end of October and released a new forecast November 1st. So good timing for this, because they have a new forecast out that I can talk about. And they raised their inflation forecast considerably for this year, and their expectation is that it is going to take several years. It won't be as high, but it will take several years for that inflation rate to ease. And between that higher level of inflation and the fact that, we did see a couple quarters of GDP decline earlier, certainly the Economic Forecasting Commission is looking at not necessarily a recession, but the possibility of a slowdown, and at the absolute bare minimum, a continued period of economic uncertainty through next year. And I think that that's an area of concern. I think we always, particularly as economists, we're always sort of thinking about business cycles, and if there is a recession, how bad will it be? I think that the reasons for optimism on this front, and I'm an optimist, so I always try to find reasons for optimism. I think the reasons for optimism here, I think if there is a recession this coming year, I think it's going to be fairly mild. I think if you look around at the economy, there are a lot of parts of the economy that are still holding up pretty well, and we're in pretty good shape. We don't have the kinds of conditions now that have preceded some recessions in the past that would lead them to be more severe. So I think from that perspective, if there is a recession, it's likely to be mild. I think the other thing, I'll point out that those federal funds we were talking about earlier, those are still continuing to flow out into Maine's economy. And so that is going to continue to help provide some economic cushion as those funds are flowing out. So if there is some sort of a slowdown or some bumps in the road, that will help to provide a cushion. And state government itself, the Budget Stabilization Fund, or the Rainy Day Fund, has $900 million in it, which is a really good cushion to be able to get state government programs and services through a period of time if there is some sort of a change in revenues that would help to give the legislature and give the governor time to respond without having to make really drastic cuts or decisions right off the bat.
Well, may I say for everyone, we love your optimism, and we take that to heart. And that's, at a time when you read, you see, you hear all of the issues, the challenges, and the problems, it's important to see the other side of that economic coin, because there are investments being made in our state. There are some very good examples of of growth within the business, but also in the economy. And that's all healthy for people to know. It doesn't get as many headlines, but it's certainly important. Let's shift our attention. There's no question that the administration and the legislature have really tried hard. The governor kept her eye on health and safety during the pandemic, never, in spite of some criticism and controversy, she never took the foot off the gas. And that proved to be very important as we have worked our way through it. The legislature also worked with the governor, and $850 was provided to people in the state to help deal with some of these inflationary costs. And you outlined, some of the issues like housing, like childcare, like broadband. We saw, and certainly childcare and housing, the beginning of the state addressing that issue. Broadband, and to your point of the capital of the congressional investment that's been brought our way for broadband to meet the governor's goal of everybody having access by 2024, it's pretty remarkable. Again, there are some good things to talk about, but if you were to pick 3 or 4 issues, we certainly can't do much about global inflation, but we can do some things, particularly around workforce and so forth. If you were to pick 3 or 4 issues that you'd recommend to either the governor or the legislature that really will have an impact, let's say on workforce or whatever you may choose, what would it be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we're doing a good job already of working on the areas where that's going to have a lot of impact. If you think about what people need to be able to fully engage in the workforce, there are a certain set of sort of social infrastructure pieces. They need a place to live. They need reliable transportation. They need childcare or some kind of dependent care. So a lot of Mainers are dealing with not just caring for children, but caring for aging parents as well. And so I think that's a piece of it to keep in mind. You've got to have broadband connections, all of those things. And so in terms of that piece of it, I think we've managed to identify those things where we need to work, and we're making some good progress on those. I think we need to continue to make progress on those, but I think everyone seems to be in pretty good agreement that those are the areas to focus on, and let's keep picking away at them. I think the other thing to keep in mind, we need to continue to see migration into the state, and we saw migration pick up both before the pandemic, but then really strongly during the pandemic. So how do we make sure that people feel like they can be engaged in the state? How do we keep them here for the long run? And then how do we make sure that everyone who is already here can be as engaged in the labor force as possible? And so that means looking at workforce training. It means looking at, are there some geographic mismatches? How can we be more creative about how we're engaging people with the workforce so that everyone is able to contribute as much as they can, so that we can continue to see employment growth down the line, which really has been potentially hindered by demographics, but we've managed to also continue to see growth because we've been able to meet some of those challenges.
Yeah, there's one issue that's more pointed. Thank you for that response. It was excellent and very encouraging. But there's one issue that we saw a lot in this recent gubernatorial debate around the workforce participation and unemployment, where one was up and the other was down. And I'm not sure how many really understood the connection that the two have, or the intersection that the workforce participation, or how it could be up on one hand and down on the other. Can you take a moment and explain that? If I even was able to explain, set up the question correctly.
Yeah, so I think in terms of workforce participation, I think one of the things to keep in mind, if you're looking at our labor force participation rate by age, if you break it out into the age segments, Maine does better in terms of labor force participation rates than the US pretty much all the way through, particularly actually at the youngest side. We do really well relative to the US in terms of labor force participation rates at the youngest workers. The problem is that we have more of the older workers who have a lower labor force participation rate. And so if you're just looking at that top line overall labor force participation rate, that's been coming down. And during the pandemic, we saw a pretty significant decline in that. I think as a lot of older workers were looking around and saying, gosh, health conditions are really concerning right now. The stock market had been doing well, so financial situations were pretty good. I suspect, I don't have necessarily evidence yet to back this up, but I suspect a lot of them were probably in the nursing profession or other professions that had seen a lot of stress come down from the pandemic. And there was a lot of burnout. And I think that those things combined to lead a lot of older workers to retire earlier than they had been expecting to. And so we knew that there was going to be a sort of a wave of retirements coming as the baby boomers continued to age into their traditional retirement years. I think we accelerated some of that.
Yeah.
Now, I think the thing that we need to consider how to do, clearly not all of them are going to unretire, and we shouldn't necessarily expect all of them to, but I think in many cases there are folks who would be perfectly happy to re-engage with the workforce in some manner. It might be more flexible hours, it might be more remote work instead of in-person work. It might be a different industry or sector than they were in previously. But I think thinking about how we can raise the labor force participation rates at that upper end of the age spectrum is going to be helpful in sort of transitioning us through while the baby boomers are continuing to age, and we can see more younger folks moving into the state as sort of a longer term solution. So I think the other thing to keep in mind is that if you're looking, and this is I'm going to get very data technical for a moment here. If you're looking at the source of that labor force and unemployment data, it's coming from a household survey that has a very, very small sample size, and it will get re-benchmarked down the line. And I've talked with the folks over at Department of Labor. They suspect that probably that will come up a little bit, that labor force participation rate data. There's not a ton of confidence in the underlying source data for those numbers on sort of that monthly basis. It's often the best we have, but it could be understating what our actual labor force is at this point.
Well, I wish I had a whole lot more time because you are a wonderful guest who builds confidence every time I hear you, not only because of your aptitude, your ability, but also because of your attitude. I mean, they have told me time and time again that consumer confidence is directly related to your attitude and how you feel about the economy. And listening to you gives, I think, anybody that watches the show or hear you speak real optimism, because even though we have a lot of challenges, Maine has a way of getting it done, and particularly if we work together. And I can say this on behalf of a lot of people, we are so grateful that you are our state economist, both for your ability, but also for your attitude. So thank you so much for what you do and for taking the time to share it with us today.
Oh, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to have you. So let's turn our attention now to another interesting, well, actually, I should welcome back Peter Van Allen from Mainebiz, because he's been on a sabbatical from us for whatever reason, but he's back with us today. And he has an interesting story to tell about how a company in Maine is dealing with a workforce challenge. There is no question that that is one of the, if not the most major challenge facing our businesses in the state. And there are all kinds of examples of creativity when it comes to this issue. You've reported recently on Hinckley Yachts, and I'm dying to have you share that with our viewers.
Thanks, Dana, and thanks so much for having me back here. I apologize for being off the air for several weeks, but so this is a story I'm actually working on for an upcoming issue. But so Hinckley Yachts is a very well-known, very high-end yacht builder. They have operations in Southwest Harbor and a big manufacturing site in Trenton. And they have over 250 employees. Now, the interesting thing is COVID brought out of the woodwork a lot of people who wanted to get outside and particularly with boats. And these guys, this is not sort of your run-of-the-mill boat company, though. We're talking like high-end boats that even on the secondary market, you're buying them used. They're mid to high six figures. The new ones can cost upward of $4, $5, $6 million for the big motor yachts. And we're talking about their customer base includes David Rockefeller, Martha Stewart, Roger Penske. So they're dealing with high-end customers. What's happened, and I think Amanda sort of set up, this segment of the show as well, because everybody has seen the labor shortage. And so Hinckley, which is trying to grow its staff by 10 to 15%, and as I said, they're around 250, 260 employees now, most of which are on the manufacturing side. They're going to unusual lengths to try to find employees. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about a program that they've started. It's interesting. They're really looking for carpenters, electricians, mechanics. Now, if they have boat building experience, all the better. But we're talking really what they're doing now is they're encouraging people who are looking to kind of change careers a little bit. They're looking for people who have been home builders, home electricians, home mechanics systems, and they're going to train them in boat building. So they've come up with a program with the Landing School, which is a terrific boat building school in Arundel in York County. And mind you, this is 3 hours, at least 3 hours from Hinckley, 3.5 hours from Hinckley. So it's not around the corner, but they're both in Maine. So they came up with the Hinckley Yachts Student Loan Assistant Program, which in essence provides financial backing so that these same people who have had experience as carpenters, electricians, mechanics can go through the Landing School, can get trained, and so that when they come out of the Landing School, they're ready to hit the ground running at the Trenton manufacturing site or the Southwest Harbor Yacht Services operation that Hinckley has. So it's a pretty neat program, and it shows, I think, the lengths to which companies are really having to go to make sure that they have the necessary workforce.
Yeah. So you as you started the show, you didn't have to apologize. I was only teasing you. I know you were busy, short of staff, and doing your work. But you made some reference to working on a story. So is this part of a series where you're taking different examples like Hinckley to show what they're doing through creativity in terms of meeting the workforce needs?
This is our last issue of the year, and the focus is on manufacturing. So I thought this is particularly, I don't know how much of the specific manufacturing I'll get into. It's really about workforce issues at a manufacturing operation. But I think it's a really interesting kind of example because these, if you look at like the Hinckley website stuff, you can see they're at a they're at a very high level. It's a premium product. Maine is known for boat builders and a lot of boat building operations, but this one is really when you're aimed at the Rockefellers and the Martha Stewarts of the world, you've got to really put out a high quality product. And I think that this is interesting just to illustrate how what lengths this particular company is going to try to build its labor force. And as I said, they're trying to build their labor force by 10 to 15%. So that would be another pretty significant number of people here, about 30 to 50 people or so.
Oh, I think it's a wonderful example. It's a very reassuring example. Whether you buy one of those yachts or not, it's really a testimonial to how businesses are trying to address on their own the effort around workforce shortage. And it doesn't remove anyone from the challenge that you see in our state. But what you do see, which gives us hope, is how they're addressing it and what they're doing, such as Hinckley. I think it's a great, encouraging message that we all enjoy hearing about because, like I said previously with Amanda, you hear and see a lot about what the problem is. And I'm not discounting the hardship that comes with it, but it's always important to hear what the good has taken place. And the success that we're seeing around the state. It's always good news. It's always great having you on. Peter, you guys do a wonderful job bringing to our attention the good news and the positive angles that businesses are undertaking. So keep up the good work.
Thanks so much, Dana. Appreciate it. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, pleasure's ours, Peter. For this week on the takeaway, I want to use this moment and this message in order to keep with the spirit and the intention of the special holiday that this week we will be taking part in. Of course, it's Thanksgiving. I want to do that because I want to acknowledge and express appreciation for the service professionals in our state. Amanda Rector is a perfect example of that, but also for the publications like Mainebiz and Peter Van Allen as its editor, what they provide for us, because they keep us informed. They tell us where we're at. They help us to understand what to expect and what lies ahead. Their efforts are extremely important to our state and to have us deal with the issues that are before us. None of us need to be told about the problems that we have faced in this last 2.5 years. It's been a difficult time, and as Amanda said, it will linger with us. Inflation will not just immediately disappear. It'll have a lingering effect, but we'll be addressing it in the meantime. We know the war has brought us not only strife and concern for our neighbors in Ukraine, but at the same time, we feel the effects of energy, of fuel, of food, and then along came the inflation that was caused by, as she so ably pointed out, a lot of factors. While we were addressed one issue, the workforce shortage to a large degree, we ended up facing the inflationary issue and brought with the cost of just about every product, from groceries to what we use for fuel, whether it's in our home or whether it's in our vehicles. And certainly the question of how long will it remain and will it be a recession or not? Her advice was very positive that it may be, but it's not going to have, by all indications, the depth or the significance that we all fear. But it's also important to know that where we're at and where we need to be, that by giving us the data, the facts, the examples that you heard of the good things that are before us, the examples that she pointed out, whether it was in some of the issues, such as broadband, such as more in-migration, or the investments that we've just recently seen $1 billion at the former Loring Air Force Base in Aroostook County for cleaner jet fuel, or the $400 million in our SAPI plant, or just recently, I think it was in today's media actually, or recently, that they talked about in Millinocket with one of the great northern plants there that pellets were being prepared to ship overseas. All of that is good news that we may not see as often because we're so dwelling, not that we should be, on the challenge before us. That's all important, and that gives us hope. The other part that really offers promise is what she said at the very beginning of the program, and that is the good fortune that we have in having before us an actual path forward. That's the 10-year strategic plan. And you think about it, it was in place with the help of 1,300 people in 2019 prior to the pandemic. It set for us a very positive path forward, but it also gave us what we absolutely needed when people came together to address an economic recovery of the pandemic, what our priorities should be. And they're still there today. And we made advancements this past session, but as she said, more needs to be done. Yes, we probably won't do much about the global inflation issue. Certainly the administration, with the help of the legislature, putting forward $850 to help ease the pain of inflation, certainly helps. No question about that. But when it comes to workforce, you know what? There's a lot that we can do. There is a lot that's already being done. That too was mentioned on the program. We've had an in-migration. We also have people from other countries that are here as asylum seekers looking to work. We need to fix at the federal level that work permit that takes so long, and in the process, we lose their skill, we lose their participation. That's a terrible thing to have happen to us. The other thing is better utilizing our people with disabilities, our veterans populations, people that have retired but want to come back perhaps part-time, full-time. We do have a broadband program in place that's going to address all of the unserved by 2024. Very ambitious, but very, very important. So when you look at a number of issues, like you heard here today also by Peter, that a lot of companies are taking the issue on their own, being creative and doing something about it. Yeah, there are good examples that we can all learn from, and that's kind of the main way. The president of the Maine Senate last evening at what chamber event said, you know, perhaps it's time for a special committee that focuses on workforce to put the various pieces together and move forward. That we can do. You know, it's true, as Amanda mentioned, there is more work to be done. It will be done. And it really, whether you're speaking of the federal, state, or local level, when you have government, the public sector, the private sector coming together, staying together, and working together, good things will result. We've seen it in the past, and we know it will happen in the future if that partnership occurs. This too will pass. And you know what? History will use this period of time as a teaching moment. But I want to pause there because I want to end the show today because this is Thanksgiving. I want to encourage us all to take time to enjoy your family, to consider your friends, to have that family turkey dinner together, to show some love, as we used to say. And I can remember my mom, who has passed away a couple of years ago, always reminding me, Dana, the two most important things in life is to love and be loved. And you know what, Mom? I wasn't so sure then that that was all that important, but through the essence of time, I totally agree. That is so important. So I hope, and my hope for you is that we take this time on Thanksgiving to think of the good in our lives. We have so much to be thankful for as residents of this great state of Maine, so much that we should not take for granted, but too often do. And in the words of all mothers everywhere, find the good and praise it. And on this day, and for every day, I make that wish for all of you. And with that, I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving. Enjoy, be kind to yourself and to one another. And until next time, take care. Bye-bye.